הפאנל הבא שלנו יעסוק באחד הארגונים העיתונאיים המסקרנים בעולם. ה-ICIJ, ראשי תיבות של הקונסורציום הבינלאומי לעיתונות חוקרת, הוא גוף מדיה שלא למטרת רווח. הוא הוקם בוושינגטון ב-1997, ובשנים האחרונות משמש כמעין מערכת מרכזית שאליה מגיעות הדלפות ענק של מסמכים. ה-ICIJ מבצע ניתוח ראשוני של המסמכים, בונה סביבה מערכת טכנולוגית מורכבת המאפשרת חיפוש וסריקה שלהם, ומעמיד את כל המכלול הזה לרשות כ-260 עיתונאים מכל העולם החברים בו. העיתונאים בתורם נדרשים בתמורה לשתף פעולה בביצוע התחקירים ולחלוק ביניהם את הממצאים. במהלך השנים הביא המודל הייחודי הזה לחשיפה של אינספור סיפורים. על קצה המזלג נזכיר את הפנמה פייפרס, את המסמכים הפנימיים של הממשל הסיני המתארים את ההתעמרות במיעוט האויגרי, את מסמכי פרדייס שעסקו בהעלמות ומקלטי מס, את הפינסן פיילס שעסקו בתנועות כספים חשודות, והרשימה עוד ארוכה. על החשיפות האלה זכה ICIJ בפרסים רבים ובראשם הפוליצר ב-2017. השנה הוגשה מועמדותו של הארגון לפרס נובל, לא פחות. בואו נעבור כאן למשתתפי הפאנל שלנו.
Vילנה, Ori, thank you very much for being here with us today. Let me introduce you briefly and then we'll go into the interview itself. פיצגיבון is a senior ICIJ reporter. He's also ICIJ's Africa and Middle East Partnership Coordinator. He took part in the Panama Papers investigation, FinCEN Files investigation, and the Paradise Papers investigation. Vילנה is the ICIJ's training manager. She's also East Europe Partnership Coordinator and part of ICIJ's data team. She took part in the FinCEN Files investigation, China Cables investigation, and the Luanda Leaks investigation. Blאו is an investigative journalist with over 20 years experience exploring political corruption, national security, and transparency issues. His work appeared in Haaretz, BBC, AP, and other outlets. Blאו took part in various ICIJ projects, including the Panama Papers. Last September, he published with Shomrim a series of investigations that were based on ICIJ's FinCEN files. Will, let's begin with you. Can you give us a brief introduction about the ICIJ and its important role these days?
Thanks, Ayle, and it's great to be here. ICIJ has existed as an organization headquartered in the United States for over 20 years now, but I think many people will know it best for its work over the past 6 or 7 years relating to a series of leaks centered on the offshore world, the world of tax havens and financial secrecy. What ICIJ does is twofold. It is both a team of journalists, data journalists, computer engineers, and researchers, and then also a team that spends, like me, a lot of time coordinating journalists on cross-border global projects. ICIJ is unique in that what we do must always have a certain threshold of internationality. That means we don't publish investigations with 2 or 3 countries involved, but rather 20, 30, or 100 countries. And although it might seem commonplace nowadays, when journalists and members of the public talk often about collaboration, as I'm sure my colleagues Vילנה and Uri on the panel will also be able to speak to, organizing systems and processing millions of documents of data so that hundreds of reporters from every country around the world potentially can access that data and can be convinced culturally to work together in a team that agrees to follow certain deadlines and to publish a global investigation together is not something that happens overnight. So ICIJ, I think, is unique in what it does in terms of a cross-border news organization that really aims to publish stories with global resonance at regular durations.
I mentioned before in my Hebrew introduction the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Prize nomination. Obviously, that's very, very impressive, but I'd like to hear what, in your opinion, is the ICIJ's biggest achievement.
I think for me, ICIJ's biggest achievement has been changing the global culture of investigative journalism. If we all close our eyes and think about what we grew up thinking an investigative journalist was, if we're a journalist or even if we're not a journalist, we associate it with probably an angry older man who smokes too much, drinks too much, sits in the back of a dark room and yells at everyone and works on his own. And that's key there, because what ICIJ has done over the years has encouraged journalists who maybe grew up in that culture to understand and see with their own eyes that the impact of your stories and the benefit for the global public is enhanced when you work with other journalists. That by sharing your leads, that by offering to help a journalist in another country, and that by coordinating with them, not only is the journalist's work improved because you can find more details, but the impact of your reporting is enhanced. And ultimately, that's why journalists become journalists, because they, I think, like I believe, there are systemic flaws within our countries and within the world that need to be addressed, and there are reforms available for those issues. And I think what ICIJ has done has really shaken up the world of investigative journalism to show and demonstrate time and time again through the impacts of projects like Panama Papers and like the FinCEN files that investigative journalism is more powerful when it's done collaboratively.
Let's take a peek into the ICIJ's newsroom. How does that leaking system work? Do you get to know the whistleblowers, or is it all anonymous?
It's a mix. And I would also say that ICIJ does not just do investigations based on leaks. We've produced a series of non-leak based investigations that look at industries in healthcare or the functioning and the weaknesses of institutions like the World Bank. But it's true that many of our big ticket investigations have in recent years been based on leaks. And what's great about that process is that the leaks come from all forms of different sources. One of our leaks on a smaller project called Mauritius Leaks literally arrived in the form of a USB key on my desk, for example. In the case of the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and also FinCEN files, there were whistleblowers who provided these leaks to journalists, say in the case of the Panama Papers to German journalists. And to their credit, those German journalists understood that there was so much documentation and there were so many countries involved in these leaked material that it would be almost a scandal for one national newspaper to keep it to themselves. So these German journalists turned to ICIJ, said, here's the data, you at ICIJ have the technology, and you also have the experience in building these teams of global reporters. I think that's an important point to make, because journalists at ICIJ who also receive leaks and other journalists are not just passively sitting waiting for the next Panama Papers to fall from the sky. I think there's sometimes a misconception that investigations based on leaks are somehow quote unquote lazy. I would argue to the contrary, that the only reason journalists receive leaks in the first place is because there are whistleblowers out there who've followed the work of those journalists and believe that those journalists are the right people to exploit, understand, and publish information related to this leaked material. What that means is we never know if we'll get the next Panama Papers tomorrow, if we'll get it next week, or if we'll get another batch in 10 years' time.
Okay, and since you mentioned it, so can you possibly give us even a tiny hint about the next story that are coming?
I knew you'd ask, and you knew I'd say no. What I can say, though, is ICIJ always works on two strands. We're always ready to receive leaks from whistleblowers directly, but also from other journalists around the world. And that's why the work of people like Vylena and I and colleagues of mine is so important, in that we're always expanding networks and relationships with new journalists, working with Shomrim, for example, for the first time. Part of my mission every week is to make sure I'm speaking to a new journalist from a new country and letting him, her, or them know that they can provide information to us. And then fingers crossed, there is a whistleblower out there who also is paying attention.
Thank you, Will. I'm a little disappointed, but I'll have to get over it. Vylena, so the ICIJ gets that huge pile of documents, and millions of them. What happens next?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for that question. I think it's very relevant. And I have to start by emphasizing what Will mentioned, is that ICIJ has become globally recognized as an organization who is trustworthy to deal with these kind of documents and these huge leaks. And again, it does work in both ways. It works in both ways because we are trusted by the public, but we are also trusted by the numerous partners all over the world who are taking part in our investigations. And when ICIJ gets this huge number of files, one of the first things that we do is that we check them. Our internal team is checking them, like checking the documents themselves and seeing, like what the story is about, how many documents are there. We are doing like the first level, I would say, of analysis of those documents. And then we are checking what countries and what partners are we going to include. It goes in phases. And then we actually start working with partners, and our entire team start working with the documents. So like the first steps are to check what countries are included. So who do we want to, and with whom we want to make new partnership, but also renew some old partnerships. But also we want to see if there is anything else that we want to add to those documents. Meaning a lot of our partners will have to do an extra step, using not only the documents that we have, but also the documents they will have to dig out themselves and report next to it. So it's even though the number of the people within ICIJ is not large, it looks like a huge machinery behind it. And most of the people are very surprised when they hear that there are only, around 40 something people behind ICIJ, and that from recent, days. Previously, it was up to 30 people who were working on all of these investigations and coordinating all of this. So I would say next to this entire process of working with documents is also working parallelly with partners, getting them involved in this and getting them on board in this. And then everything like this is like having a lot of meetings, having a lot of trainings, and coordinating everything so that 200 or 400 people would, work together as one very organized and very professional newsroom.
Okay. And another interesting question is with the vast amounts of documents, how do you make sure that you identify all the hidden stories?
Another good question. I would say you are never quite convinced that you identify all of them, right? Yeah. But this is why we are trying to work with the best there is, like the best journalists and the best newsrooms around the world are working with us on these documents and on these leaks. This is why we are trying to identify as many stories as we can. So basically, we are working with the either small newsrooms around the world or really important ones and big ones. But what we are trying to achieve is that from each of the country, we have at least some important stories that we basically don't miss. We do also have like the in-depth work from our side and from the side of the partners that kind of I would hate to say guarantee and then something else happens after the publication of the stories, but we are giving our best so that wouldn't happen. Sometimes when you have a 10 million and plus document, that's almost impossible to do, right? Because no matter how many partners you have, it's a really vast and in-depth work. But what we do, and as you know, ICIJ has databases like offshore leaks database, like medical device databases. So journalists around the world who are willing to dig more through the documents can potentially find more information and potentially do more stories based on the documents that we have previously received. And I have to say that even to this day, like nowadays, it's like the 5th anniversary of Panama Papers. We are all the time informed that more and more journalists are still doing the stories related to Panama Papers or anything else that we have done previously.
Okay, that's very interesting. Can you describe the way investigation begins and then develops?
Sure. So it's I usually mention something like it's the Ocean 12 film. It's not Ocean 12. Yeah. It's Oceans. It's ICIJ's 400. So what we're trying to do is we try to once we assess the leak, once we assess the documents, what we try is to approach to the partners that we trust, that we know that want to work with us. They're from one side extremely, great at what they do, but also really kind and caring and taking care of, other partners in the team. So first we try to form the team, but then what we do with partner is that ICIJ has like several teams. One is a team of developers who are developing the platforms that we are using for communication on one side and for sharing the knowledge and sharing the data, which is data share, that it's also online and everybody can download it. It's designed by our developers and it's extremely useful. So everybody who wants to use it can use it as a really convenient analyzing tool and platform. Then we have a data team, and data team analyzes documents in different levels, on different ways throughout the project and helping partners I would say almost any story that has come out of any leak has a lot of data elements in it. And then, of course, we have the team of editors and reporters who are doing a massive job in reporting from this leak. Simultaneously with all of this, what we do with partners is that we train them into using the platforms, but also we train them into understand the data, knowing what to do with them, explain them what we have found, but they also explain us what they have found, because only if we work together, it works for all of us.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Uri, your perspective is probably a little different. Let's take the Panama Papers as an example to your work. One morning you get access to 12 million documents. What do you do next with it?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me here. It's a great question. It is indeed a massive trove of document, and its sheer size and cooperative aspects were pretty new at the time when I first got involved with the ICIJ and the Panama paper. So there is a major learning curve that you have to go through with this kind of project. And first, initially, it really means like spending the time in learning it. It's almost like learning a new language. Panama Papers, for example, ranged in countries, years, dozens of years, many languages, technical terms, all this stuff you have to learn. So really it means like you have a very long nights and not much sleep when you get initial access to this, and then you work on it, and then you have no sleep because you're approaching deadline. Basically, because of the cooperative aspect within ICIJ, once me or Will or any other journalist would find a lead that would be or might be relevant to other people, we would share it within an internal platform. You can call it like an internal Facebook of ICIJ, in which we can securely exchange ideas, leads, tips, and build up cooperation. In the last investigation that we worked on, and together with Shomrim, for example, one major story involved journalists from Denmark, Slovenia, Italy, Israel, and I probably forgot some countries. It involved and it was based on a big previous investigation conducted by OCCRP called the Azari Laundromat. But basically, the FinCEN file helped us understand that money that were funneled into some suspicious Azari companies was somehow involved Israel aerospace industry. We could have never done this without ICIJ and without this kind of platforms that would enable us to share ideas and leads.
You mentioned sharing. Sharing is something that journalists are not very happy to do, at least the journalists I know. How did it work for you?
You get to learn that sharing is caring, but indeed this is not this is not where we come from as journalists. I had to think about it, but what Will said earlier on, maybe I'm that, I was younger, but maybe I'm that old guy at the back of the newsroom with the cigarettes when I used to smoke and the black coffee. You might remember it, Eyal.
I do.
It's true. We as journalists are not known for our small egos, modesty, and the desire to share things. And we have to do just that in order to succeed in an organization like ICIJ. And really, I believe we have to do just that almost in order to succeed in today's media landscape, because I think what Will and Yelena to some respect said, it's very true. The landscape of journalism have changed, and a lot has to do with the new ideas that ICIJ has brought to the table. So indeed, this is not something that we grow up with as journalists, but I think with time, you realize that at the end of the day, after one round of the Luxembourg leaks, the Lux leaks, or HSBC leaks, and the Panama Papers, eventually you understand that the outcome is so massive, and nobody could have done it by him or herself. I mean, Will mentioned, I think, the Süddeutsche Zeitung journalist who brought the Panama Papers to ICIJ. Come to think about it, it's pretty amazing that journalists would really give up such an incredible treasure. But I think they understood pretty early on that you just can't do it without it. And it is true that as a journalist working in this kind of organization and with such big amount of information, one thing that is really hard to digest is the understanding that you probably miss some stories. You're definitely going to miss some stories. But then again, at the end of the day, there is a very, the longevity of the stories is quite amazing, because as Yelena mentioned, we still can use the Panama paper to identify news stories. If somebody who were a businessman in Israel came to power just now, the first thing you want to do is go back to ICIJ-like platforms and databases and see if he or she appears there. And so it never ends on D-Day, on the day of publication.
It's fascinating. I have many more questions, but I keep getting signals that we're way behind our time. So I have to thank you again for being here with us today. Yelena, Uri, Will, and let's hope for many good stories in the future.
We'll try. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.